Hello and welcome to the Hub event as a part of the Royal Economic Society Conference in 2022, being organized at Ashoka University in India. We are very pleased that the RES decided to try this model of organizing Hub events at different locations. And we are very excited to report that prior to the keynote which we are about to hear, we had a invigorating and exciting session on the theme that Professor Farzana Afridi is going to talk to us about today. We will upload the link of our session as well later on, and audience members who are listening to the keynote are welcome to check out the papers that were presented earlier in the day. However, I have the very pleasant task right now to introduce to you Professor Farzana Afridi of the Indian Statistical Institute, New Delhi, who's joining us from Singapore today, where she's visiting. Professor Afridi is a leading scholar of work on gender, labor markets, and she's been leading very path-breaking initiatives on studying the effect of technology on the changing patterns of work by men and women, and what accounts for the low and declining labor force participation rate of Indian women, a puzzle that has been, very intriguing to observers of India and to development economists. Her work is rigorous, it's innovative, and it adds to our insights considerably. So I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Afridi, and I would, Farzana, handing over the Zoom to you now. Please type in your questions in the chat box. And I will interrupt Professor Afridi if needed and present her with the questions. Thank you.
So before I start, I just want to say a deep, thank you to Ashwini Deshpande, Professor Ashwini Deshpande, for organizing a very, stimulating workshop that we've just we have had four stimulating papers that we've just listened to. And she herself is a leader in the work that I'm going to be talking about. So we are learning a lot from her work as well. And of course, to thank RES for seamlessly, putting this array of talks and events together. So without much ado, let me share my screen. Okay, thank you. So let me jump into basically first starting with what is the outline of the presentation. First, I'm going to put together a bunch of facts about gender differences in participation in domestic and market work. And some of this has been discussed in the papers that we were, were presented in the workshop that we've just concluded. And also mentioned by Ashwini in her opening remarks to the workshop. Based on these facts, I'm going to pose a certain, a set of questions related to what the role of technology could be in terms of both the effect of these facts on the potential impact of technological change in influencing women's labor force participation and the time that they spend on market work. And I'm going to do this by talking through three different elements of technological change to highlight the fact that the impacts of technological change could be gendered. First, I'm going to talk through two studies, which will look at productivity enhancing technological change. And in that context, I look at both changes in home production technology. So in that example, I'll be specifically looking at shifts towards using clean fuels, given that women, and I'll show you data, which will highlight the fact that women spend a significant amount of time on cooking within the domestic work and the home production activities that they undertake, and a technology which potentially reduces the time that they spend on cooking, what effect it may have on the labor force participation or the time that they allocate to productive work or work which is remunerative. The second technological change that I'm going to look at is change in market production technology. So this will be looking specifically at agriculture and how farm mechanization has taken off in India in the last few decades, and what the effect of that has been on the gender differential in the allocation of labor to farm work. And then I'm going to look at a third study, which is going to focus on the search costs, on rather reducing the search costs when it comes to looking for jobs. And specifically, I'll be looking at a digital job search technology, which aims to improve employer-employee matching. And this is relevant in the context of the low mobility that we observe of women, which could be one of the constraints in terms of accessing work, but also the fact that women prefer flexible work, and there's the potential of this technology to be able to provide them jobs or access to jobs which are more aligned towards the preferences that women may have, given the gendered allocation of time within the household. And then based on what the conclusions I've reached from these studies, I'm going to summarize and basically conclude about what the role of technology can be in terms of shifting what we observe as these gender differences in time allocation, both within domestic as well as market work. So to begin with the facts first then, we understand that women's time allocation to domestic work is disproportionately higher than men's time allocation. And this we just discussed in the paper that Nick has presented in the workshop, and also discussed by Ashwini in her opening remarks. But what I think we don't focus on that much is the fact that there also exists a reverse a gender gap in participation in market work, which is particularly true in developing countries such as India. And all the papers that I will be looking at and discussing here will focus on India. And so this gender differential in allocation of time, we can consider that as the gender-based division of labor, which we know does exist when it comes to domestic work or home production, but also can manifest in market production. So when we think of production processes where men could have a comparative advantage, or women, you could think of it in a reverse way as well, that women have a comparative advantage in performing certain tasks vis-a-vis men, specifically agriculture, then you could think of the context where you also see this gender division of labor in remunerative work and not just in domestic work. So to give you some data and to look at the picture. So on the left-hand side, what we have is the time spent in domestic work in terms of hours per week. This is coming from the Time Use Survey of 2019, and we're looking at the distribution of that time by the educational attainment of the woman. And what you see, and of men, so these are matched husband-wife pairs that we are looking at. And so the red line essentially shows you the time allocated by men to domestic work, and the blue line for women. And what you see is this big gender gap, but also the fact that women spend considerably more time in domestic work than men do. And then when we go to the right-hand side, where we're looking at the time spent at work in hours per week. So this is, again, the flip side. And we see, of course, that the lines also flip completely. So men spend significantly more time, and almost equivalent to the amount of time that women spend on domestic work, whereas women spend very little, about 10 hours per week in market work, right? So we see this reversal in terms of the gender-based division of labor, which gets mirrored in the participation in market work. And then when I was talking about the gender-based division of labor at work, and we will specifically want to focus here on the allocation of time of labor in agriculture in India. When you look at the left-hand side graph here, which is looking at the operation-wise share of labor, you see that the share of labor, of women's labor, which goes to operations such as tilling and sewing, for instance, is much less, or the gender gap that we observe, particularly in tilling, is very large. And that is an activity where you require more physical effort. And this becomes sort of more stark when we look at ICRISAT data, which gives us operation-wise share of labor hours per acre of land cultivated. And then you can see that, this gap gets reversed when we look at tasks such as weeding and harvesting. So women are spending much more or a large proportion of their labor is being used in this what we can call downstream activity of weeding, which is a later stage in the agricultural production, and harvesting, which comes last, as compared to tilling. And there the gaps in the gender gaps in the time spent in terms of labor hours reverse. So women's labor is less likely to be used in operations that require physical strength, which would be tilling, for example, and precision tasks such as weeding, for instance, women would have a comparative advantage in tasks such as this. So we're looking at a particular production process where you see this gender division of labor. Probably, you could say that's because of certain comparative advantages. And we also, at the same time, as I pointed out, see this gender division of labor within the home. So the set of questions that I want to ask here and address in terms of these studies would be trying to understand whether technological change can alter these facts that we observe in terms of the allocation of time. So do changes in production technology, and I'm going to focus both on home production technology as well as market production technology, are they going to reinforce or reduce these gender differences in time allocation? So I'm not spending too much time talking about the literature. We know what has been observed, for example, in the US and the developed countries in terms of technological change and its impact on women's time allocation, particularly within the home sphere. What would be interesting is to kind of understand whether we should see similar kinds of effects in a developing country, low-income context. So what are those factors which should determine the impact of technological change on women's time in either market or home production? And I'm going to try to understand what those factors might be, which are then going to feed into trying to understand whether changes in production technology are reinforcing or reducing these gender differences. The second part is to understand whether technology that loosens constraints on women's time allocation. So as I mentioned, mobility constraints, constraints which are enforced by these existing gender norms around time allocation, which create these preferences for work closer to home. How do they get affected when we try to address those constraints potentially through digital technology? Would it be the case that both men and women benefit equally, or there would be gender differences in the advantages that this digital technology brings to lowering these job search costs and providing opportunities for more flexible work? So these are, the two broad set of questions that we hope to answer with these papers. And so at the outset, what I want to point out is that we are going to see in these particular contexts that there will be a gendered, what we observe at least is that there are gendered impacts of technological change. And very often we may see women losing out even when technological changes could potentially be productivity enhancing or cost reducing in terms of finding work. So the first study that I'm going to discuss is looking at home production technology. And specifically, it is going to focus on inducing households to shift towards using clean fuels for cooking, and I'll elaborate on what I mean by clean fuels, and also give you some evidence to show that it is a productivity enhancing technological change, in the sense that it could potentially be time saving, and that would particularly be useful for women because they spend a larger proportion of their time on cooking than men do. So this was a study that we conducted on household cooking fuel usage, and with very detailed time use data across 150 villages in the rural areas of Indore in Madhya Pradesh. And I'm going to start with talking about the earliest round of data collection that we did in October and December of 2018, which was our baseline. And what we did in this was then interview, besides, of course, the other household members, a very focused survey of primary cooks in almost 3,000 randomly sampled households in these villages to collect detailed time use data for the previous 24 hours. And just using the baseline survey data to understand what is the allocation of time of women in households which have access to a specific clean fuel. We are focusing here particularly on LPG, or the liquid petroleum gas, which has also been one of the flagship programs of the Indian government, which is called the Ujjwala program, which was launched in 2016. And we are going to look at households which have access to LPG. And by access, it means households which have an official, what we call a connection, in the sense of being able to get subsidized LPG cylinders, and those which do not have access and would be using dirty solid fuels such as fuel wood and cow dung. So what you see on the left-hand side here is from our own survey in 2018, the average weekly hours spent on domestic work, and we've categorized it into different kinds of work which is related to domestic activities. So there's fuel collection, water collection, cooking, cleaning, and so on. And what stands out here is that by far the largest proportion of time that women spend in doing domestic work comes from cooking and cleaning. Surprisingly not from childcare. Of course, there could be multitasking, and also not from fuel collection and water collection. And this, holds up very well when we look at the National Time Use Survey data as well for 2019. And we again see the same thing, that the amount of time spent on cooking and cleaning is by far larger than other categories of domestic work that women might be doing. So that's something that we want to keep in mind, that so when we want to think about productivity enhancing technological change and we are shifting to LPG, can we make the claim that the amount of time that women spend potentially in cooking could get reduced as a result of access to LPG? So in this particular graph, what we have is the amount of time it took the woman to prepare the last meal. And what you see over here is households which say that they've used LPG in this last meal preparation versus households which have used the traditional stove. And you can see that there is about a 30-minute difference in the time that it takes to prepare the meal. And we also try to look at it in terms of just access in terms of whether they have an LPG connection or they don't have an LPG connection. And again, it shows the same thing, that it could put, this shift from using regularly LPG and away from firewood and dung is going to be time saving for women. And we want to try to understand how much this time saving could be. So before we get to cooking, one of the first things that strikes us is that women do disproportionately spend more time on firewood collection, on dung collection and making. And so what we have on the column here, on the first column, is households with LPG connection. And then in the second one, households without. And then we look at the difference in the time that, so this is first in terms of the visits made by the households for firewood collection, and particularly by the primary cook, and the time spent, as well as for dung. And what you can see here is that there's significantly less time that they are spending. It's about 25 to 25 minutes for firewood, and around 30 to 35 minutes or so for dung making and collection. So there is some time saving there. And then when we are thinking of now breaking that up into more aggregate categories, where we're looking at time spent by women in personal care, domestic work, childcare, and income generating work. So this is all kinds of work that women would be doing, whether it's self-employment, it's on the farm. We're not talking about paid work, formal paid work, and time spent in leisure. So what you see here is that in terms of differences between access and without access, it seems that any reduction in or gain in terms of time saving would probably get allocated to more leisure. And this negative that we see on, or less time being spent on income generating activity, is probably could be reflective of selection, in the sense that households which have LPG connection might be better off households, and so fewer women are less likely to work there. But so we want to understand what is the potential impact in terms of trying to draw some causal link. And so first, what we do with the baseline data is just do a propensity score matching, which is match households which have LPG connection and don't have an LPG connection. And so they're similar on characteristics. And then we look at the distribution of time of the primary cook within and compare it between these two sets of households. And again, this is what we'd expected, given the summary statistics that we saw, big chunks of time being saved essentially on dung collection, about 20 minutes on domestic work. And most of it seems to get allocated to leisure per day, not seeing much activity in terms of income generating work, seeing an increase. So based on this, baseline data that we had, we ran a randomized control trial, which was an information campaign or an awareness campaign, where we wanted to provide information about the damaging health effects of using these unclean or dirty fuels. And also at the same time, there was another treatment group which was provided information both on the health benefits as well as the public subsidies that are provided for LPG cylinders. And we exploit this randomized information provided by these village health activists. So this data that I was discussing so far was 2018, and we ran this information campaign for about 9 months. We go back to these households during the same season and then ask them about, again, for the primary cook, the time allocation following the intervention. And what we find is that the estimated time savings in cooking were very low. It was around 5 minutes per day. And this is despite the fact that the information intervention did observe significant shifts in the household fuel usage away from solid fuels or other, more regular usage of LPG. So there should have been some productivity enhancing effects within the household. But also these effects that we see in terms of take up are marginal. They are not very large shifts towards clean fuel usage, in the sense that it is a complete shift away from solid fuels. There's still usage of mixed fuels within the household. So we try to understand why is it that the take up is small, or the fact, and accompanied by the fact that there is very little time saving that we actually observe happening within the household. So what we figured is that if we look at the what the government mandated unskilled wage rate is in this area, which is about 280 rupees per hour, so that comes to about 35 rupees per hour, and we're looking at the potential when we're just doing the propensity score matching estimates, when we value that 2.5 hours per week of potential time savings, then it comes to only about 5% of rural monthly household income being saved. So what I'm trying to say over here is that first, the potential time savings is, possibly the 30 minutes or so that we observe, or the 25 minutes that we could get, is itself going to translate into a very low value for the household in terms of being only 5% of rural monthly household income. And then given that we see smaller shifts with this information campaign, then that is an even smaller, around 1% of rural monthly household income, which would the households could gain if the time that the woman saves is translated into market work, right? Now, so what we need, what I think I want to emphasize here is that even if we see some shifts in clean energy, first of all, those shifts towards usage of clean energy might be small, despite very strong nudges rather. They're not going to lead to transformative shifts in time allocation to home production. The reason being that the fuel collection the fact that this is an activity that is not undertaken every day. And we see the biggest gains in terms of time, or the time savings happening in fuel collection. And that the small time savings, which is about 25 minutes or 30 minutes, which is also held up by other studies which look at shifts from using traditional cooking stoves to more fuel efficient cooking stoves, not necessarily going to clean fuel. These small time savings cannot be bundled together or aggregated, right? So you're kind of saving 30 minutes or 15 minutes in the morning cooking, you're saving some 15, 20 minutes in the evening cooking. And it's not a big enough chunk of time that you can aggregate and put together so that you can reallocate that to remunerative work. That's number one. And number two is what we see is that the value of women's time is low due to this. What we observe, at least, is the limited market demand. So in contexts where there isn't enough demand for women's work, the households are not going to be incentivized to shift from dirty fuels to clean fuels because the time savings is of very little value to them. So that's the first study, which from the home production technology context, which is telling us that it's probably not going to have the transformative effects that we would expect in terms of time savings. And we probably are going to see a reallocation towards leisure rather than towards market work. Okay, so the second study is looking at market production or agriculture production technology, and specifically farm mechanization. So this is again rural context. And between 1999 to 2011, what we see is that the number of tractors in India tripled, which increased the intensity of tractor usage significantly. As a result of this increased mechanization, the farm yields improved, particularly for wheat and coarse cereals. And this is also a period where we observe that the proportion of working age adults in the farm sector, so that we are seeing a structural shift away from agriculture to non-agricultural sector. The usage of adult labor is falling by 11 percentage points during this period. And this is also a period where we see a dramatic decline in the labor force participation rates of women. And this is particularly true for married women in rural India, where who are driving this decline, and we see relative stagnancy in urban areas. So something is happening in a rural context, which is causing this decline. And that has something to do with structural changes that are happening. So just to give you some idea of this, in terms of figures, What we have on the left-hand side is labor usage broken down by female and male. And you see this big fall happening between 2005 and 2010. So this gap, gender gap increases. And this is also accompanied by increased usage of mechanized implements such as tractors and power tillers. So how do we figure out what is the positive, the causal impact of farm mechanization? Because after all, adoption of machinery.
Farzana, there's a
Yeah.
question on your previous study.
Yeah.
So should I ask that? Do you find any changes in how adolescent girls allocate their time? Perhaps before it was them in the household spending more time fetching firewood or sharing some of the cooking, and after your treatment, they see the most benefits?
Okay, that's a good question. So I was looking what the figures that I showed you, if I go back to that, these are, we have some adolescent girls in our sample, but not too many. And I haven't really broken it down to look at adolescent girls in particular. I don't think the sample would be large enough to give us enough power to reach any conclusions there. But I think that's an interesting hypothesis to look at. Okay. So going back to this, then, what we do is we construct a district level data set, which from 1999 to 2011, we use multiple sources in terms of figuring out not just the employment and labor usage, but also inputs. Which also included very laboriously digitizing district level soil quality data. And the idea here is based on the agricultural literature, which suggests that machine usage, particularly in tilling, is determined, or a significant determinant of that is the extent of loaminess of the soil. So if you compare soil which is loamy relative to clayey soil, then loamy soil is more amenable to deep tillage. So you are probably going to see a greater adoption of mechanized tools. And we are in particular looking at tilling, in land tilling, where you have a larger share of the soil which is loamy relative to clay. So we create these measures of the relative loaminess of the soil in each district. And we look at that as an instrument for determining the take-up of mechanization across districts during this period. And that essentially is a determinant of this exogenous variation in the adoption of tractors and the extent of mechanization. So what do our results suggest when we look at this period is that a 1 percentage point increase in mechanization. And this is, and remember, I mean, if I go back to the data that I had, or the facts that I had discussed in the beginning, and if you remember what those figures were showing was that men's labor is disproportionately used more in tilling than it is in, let's say, particularly weeding, because when we're looking at tasks which require precision, where women might have a comparative advantage as opposed to tasks which require more physical effort and labor. And tractors are complementary to men's labor. And what we observe is that this adoption of tractors decreases female labor use significantly, which translates into an elasticity of about half. But we don't see any effect of mechanization on men's labor. And that points to the fact that, again, that men's labor, whose labor is going to be used in terms of running those tractors. It is the men's labor, so it's complementary to the machinery. And what is interesting is that this decline that we observe in women's labor is driven by the fall in their labor usage in weeding. And why would that be the case? If it is that machines are doing a much better job, more, let's say, more efficient job of tilling the land and preparing the land, the need for weeding down as a downstream activity is going to be less. And therefore, the demand for women's labor downstream is going to decline because of this productivity enhancing effect, which is happening upstream, which is complementary to men's labor. But what is further interesting is we want to understand again in terms of structural transformations that are happening is why is it that women are not reallocating their labor then to the non-farm sector, given that there is a lower demand for their labor now due to the mechanization. And we look at what's happening to women's labor use in construction industry or in manufacturing and so on, and we don't see a substitution or a reallocation of their labor towards these sectors in response to this mechanization. And that again is pointing to the fact that there could be not sufficient demand for women's labor outside the farm sector in particular. And all of us are aware of the fact that India has been moving away from agriculture, and a much larger proportion of the GDP is coming from the non-farm sector. And that's, again, an issue to highlight. So when you have a case where you have technological change happening and some particular types of labor are losing out, they're not being able to find re-employment in other sectors of the economy. And so then this brings me to this third study. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this one because this is more of a work in progress, and it would be nice to get more feedback on this. So what we are thinking of here is what is the role? So when we think of what these two papers so far have sort of told us is that it seems that there is this low value for women's labor, and this low value obviously stems somehow from this low demand that is for women's labor. And you juxtapose that with, gender norms and so on and so forth, which is about limited mobility, the gender division of labor within the household in particular, which can cause that limited mobility. You would think that that is going to translate into potentially higher job search costs for women because you're more constrained in terms of being closer to home, looking for work which is closer to home. You want more flexibility in terms of the work that you can take up, but also you have to search much more widely to be able to find work, given that there is potentially, a paucity of demand and there is low value for your labor. So what we are seeing essentially here is that in equilibrium, obviously there is an interaction between demand and supply factors, and that's going to determine what this equilibrium is going to be at in terms of women's time allocation and time spent in the labor market, right? So so now we are, and I just want to point out that this is not in the rural sector anymore. This study is focusing on the urban sector, but you could see how this potentially could have an impact even in the rural sector, where people don't have information about the opportunities or other or job prospects that they might have, particularly for women. And there is this technology that is available that could reduce this mismatch between demand and supply. So what we want to do, what we try to do in this study is essentially try to see whether we can address some of the demand side factors by bringing employers closer to the worker in a sense, and also try to provide better matches to the workers. But at the same time, we're trying to leverage social networks to improve technology adoption, because this is a new technology. It is an unknown, element, and you might have better take up if you see your peers also taking up this technology. So what we are doing in this study was we were following almost 7,000 individuals in low-income residential areas of Delhi over 2 years. And we look at matched husband-wives. There are about 1,500 married couples. So this is in the prime working age group of 18 to 45 who form our main respondents. And then we also have data that we collected on up to or 2 peers for both the husband and the wife who were part of the social network, and we followed them over these 2 years. So I think this is going to bring together a lot of things that we've been discussing in the papers, and also many of the things that Ashwini mentioned. So one of the things that you'd see here is, of course, number one, that 96% of the husband report being engaged in the labor market. And we've asked these questions in terms of the activity in which you allocate the highest amount of time. It's not just in terms of earnings. And 24% of the women or the wives report working, which is very close to what we see in PLFS and other national surveys. And then if you look within this group of women who are working, the majority are self-employed. Whereas if you look at men, then a majority of them, of course, there are a lot of them who are self-employed also, though, and all these numbers are big, but the largest proportion seems to be in salaried employment. And again, the monthly earnings differences are pretty big between the husbands and the wives. And on the right-hand side, we ask questions about job preferences. And again, something that stands out is the fact that the husbands and the wives, both of them have very high preference for salary jobs. So I would call these like kind of high status jobs. And this is, the more husbands are much more likely to prefer those kinds of jobs for their wives. Though of course it's also high for the wives themselves, but also that the preference for home-based work is very high, both for women as well as men. And again, significantly about a 3 percentage point higher for wives than it is for husbands. And so what we deduce from there is that women are most likely to be self-employed in own business if they're working. What we find is 74% of the women are neither working nor are they looking for work. But what is important is that they want particular types of work. Again, we focus on what are these job preferences. And I can't get into all the tables, but number one, they want greater job flexibility to 80%. As we said, women want home-based or sort of part-time work, and 78% of their husbands. This is coming from the platform data itself, and where at the time of registering on the platform, women were asked about what their stated preference was to work in terms of distance. And they were interested in working it was less than half of the distance that was reported by men. So again, they want work which is closer to home. Women have limited mobility. And what was very interesting that stood out for us is that there is a greater mismatch in terms of what women's expectations are of salaries, for how much they're willing to work for, in a sense, you could think of it like that, as compared to what they're currently earning. So if we just condition this on women who were currently employed, so the current employment, the monthly earnings are about 3,800, but when they register on the platform, they're looking for earnings of something like 10,000. So that gap in terms of what the actual earnings are and what the expected earnings are pretty large, and that gap is much larger for women than it is for men. And then again, this norm of men as breadwinners, which is a part of our narrative when we're discussing women's work status within India. Again, only 33% of husbands approve a married woman working if the wife has a husband who's capable of earning, right? So I just wanted you to keep all these factors in mind and then sort of evaluate what the impacts we see are. and then, so besides the fact that we have these, preferences for the kinds of work that women want to do, and the norms around the kinds of work that are preferred by women, we also see a very interesting structural difference in the social networks by gender. And what I wanted to highlight over here is the fact that of the network of the wife, 75% are non-co-resident relatives. So these are going to be, people who don't reside with them, but they are members of their family, of their extended family. And so what it tells us is that women's networks are very homebound, they're very narrow, and they're very family based. So as a result of that, there is a significant overlap of the husbands and the wives' networks. So what information might be coming into the wife's network is likely to flow also into the husband's network. And this again speaks to the growing literature which talks about how women are very much restricted to within the home. And as you can see, they have absolutely no network within work. And this is, we still do have 24% of women who are working, but we don't see them, referring to them as their peers whom they are close to.
Farzana,
yeah.
a clarificatory question about this network question. What was the exact question that you asked, and how many people did individuals have to name as a part of their network? What did they understand by network?
Yeah, so we used a name matching process for understanding who are the people that these individuals are the closest to. So we would start with context. We'll say, tell us, who do you most often talk to over the phone? Who do you go to for an emergency, like an health emergency? Who can you borrow money from? Who would you go for a walk to the park? And so we would, at work, who would you have lunch with, or who would you go to work with, right? So we used all these contexts and then asked them to generate names. And based on the names that they generated, we created a list of people that they interact with most often, that they're most likely to be socially connected to, whether it is within the home, outside the home, so they could be neighbors and so on. And then what we ask them is, here's a list of 4 or 5 names that you've given us. Out of these, can you tell us 2 who you think are the closest to you? Okay, so these are these, and this one is not based on those 2. I think we put all the data together in terms of proportion. So that's how we define social networks. So these are the social connections they have in multiple contexts, emergencies, financial, work related, and so on. So I hope that answers the question. Okay, so what we do with the job matching platform technology, essentially here, this is a hyperlocal app-based job aggregation platform. So what we mean by hyperlocal is it's very much like Uber. So if you can think like, you're going out, you're looking for the closest taxi that's available, a driver who can take you to wherever you want, you're going to see a drop-down list of whoever is available. And in the case of Uber, they will immediately, tell you that this guy is closest to you, take this particular taxi. So it's hyper local because it's within a very small radius, and it's app based, and it's aggregating all the employers that you can potentially see on that, or rather, I would say, all the workers who can potentially be seen by the employer within that radius. So how does it work? It connects the employer directly with multiple blue-collar workers who are located closely. The worker would first register on the platform, and this is at no cost. There is some verification process and so on and so forth. Once they're registered on the platform, then a potential employer who's using that app is going to see the matched worker profile. So they'll say, okay, I want to look for a carpenter for a 1-hour job that I have to do. Or it could be longer term contracts or short term contracts. These are not necessarily gig work. Then, or it could be, for instance, looking for maids, for instance, right? So these could be long term contracts as well. Then when the potential employer sees these worker profiles, the employer can call or choose amongst those profiles which worker to call with a job offer. If there is a match, then the employer is going to pay a fee to the platform. And then, so either you end up with a match or you don't end up with a match, and the worker can, of course, accept or reject the offer. So workers can potentially connect with many potential nearby employers. You don't have any agents, agencies, and of course, so that is one sense which, you have low job search costs. You're also not physically moving, looking around for work. Also information frictions and so on. And then you choose the job as per your preferred, the preferences that you have mentioned on the platform. So there'll be a host of these characteristics, what is your background, what is the salary that you're looking for, how far are you willing to go, what kinds of jobs can you do, and so on, and skill levels, etc. So we conducted a randomized controlled trial, which, as I said, was aiming to bridge this demand supply gap. So we have the first treatment where these matched husband-wife pairs were informed about this platform and offered to register on the job portal. And we offered this service to both the husband and wife simultaneously, in the sense that they would be aware of the decision that either the husband or the wife has taken in terms of registration, because in the real world, labor market or labor supply decisions are joined, and we wanted to stick to reality. In the second one, in addition to the husband and wife, we also offered the service to two of the wife's peers in her network, only the wife's peers. This was to, improve take up of this particular technology, and then we have the control group. So what do we see? Very surprising results. One is that offering the job search service to both the couples and the wife's network increased the probability that the husband was employed during this is 1 year after the intervention. So the intervention happened in 2019-20. And we ended bang in time before COVID started in March. So our intervention finished in February. We did 2 end lines. One was about 6 months after the intervention. So this was about August of 2020 or so. I'm not mentioning the results for that because we don't see any significant effects. That was a completely, not a natural state of affairs given the pandemic and the shutdown that we had. So naturally, we do not see any impacts. We go back again in April to June of, or rather May to June of 2021. And this is as of June of 2021.
Farzana, there are a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One is a clarificatory question. What language was this app in? And the second question is a gender wage gap in the current study appears to be much higher. Female earnings are about 0.1 of male earnings compared to national level employment statistics, which is around 0.4 to 0.7. So how do you react to that?
I think those are not, I don't think those are conditional on working. The statistics that I that I just showed, I think you're looking at this particular, I just answered the last one first. This one here, this one, right? I think you're asking about this question. So yeah, this gap is, as far as I remember, this is not conditional on working. So if I make it conditional on working, the gap is going to be much less. You're absolutely right. This is for the full sample. So this is irrespective of their work status. So obviously this falls dramatically because there is a large proportion of women who are not working. The second question was asking about
the language
of the app. There was no language issue because it was our survey team which was registering them. And so I mean, if you're interested in understanding what the process was, first we would go, when we're going to the household during the intervention, we'll explain to them what this platform is. We had a video that we developed along with our platform collaborator. which would talk about, some beneficiary person, either a woman. If it was a woman respondent, it would be a video of a woman talking about how she'd gone on the platform and, how she's benefited from it in terms of finding jobs. And then similarly for the male. And after we talked about this, gave this information and so on, we would ask them, would you be interested in getting onto the platform? And if they were interested, then we would onboard. There's a process which is called onboarding, which would be, finding out about their, if, for instance, if you're interested in being a driver, then you need to have a driving license. There's also some police verification that is done. So we need to figure out, what their IDs are and so on. So at the back end, then the platform is going to do the verification process. And we take their phone number and everything. And then they're going to get a call from the platform to register them. And that will be a person at the other end who will be talking to them and asking them about their job preferences, their experience, and so on. And that's all entered into their database. And and you don't need a smartphone for this. And that's the reason we picked this particular platform, because, women are, we have, in our regressions, we control for whether they have a mobile phone or not. We've asked a lot of data on that. Women are less likely to have smartphones. Men are more likely to have smartphones. On average, people are less likely to have smartphones. So this was a service where you just needed to have a simple phone that could take phone calls. And so the employer is going to call you on that registered number if a potential employer has a job offer. Okay, so there are no...
There's a suggestion that the language question may be referring to programming language. Is that...
I'm not sure what the programming language is. In terms of the algorithm, I think the question then is, what is the algorithm that is being used by the platform? Is that correct?
I mean, I'm just reading out. So
okay, maybe I can ask after I finish. So what we see is that, as I said, that the probability that the husband was employed, and our reference period is not as of that day. So we are asking, in the previous 3 months, were you working or not? And we asked, and that went up by 4.4 percentage points. That's about 14% of an effect. And we asked, if you were working, how many days per week, how many hours per day. We also asked about monthly earnings and so on. And we see an increase on all these dimensions for men 1 year after the intervention, but only in the network treatment. The women, on the other hand, interestingly, conform to gender norms. And so we only see an increase in the self-employment by 4.5 percentage points. We don't see any overall employment effects. Again, 1 year after the intervention and only in the network treatment arm. We do not see any significant effects of the treatment on any of these dimensions of work in the couples only treatment when the network was not engaged in the, was not offered the platform service. So what is it, what's happening? Why is it that we see these effects for men and we don't see them for women? So the first thing, as I pointed out to you, if you remember, is the structural difference in terms of the social networks of men and women. There is this big overlap in the fact that women are so confined to their houses, to their homes, that the people that they are daily in contact with are not only co-resident family members, they are relatives and so on, but are also more likely to be men, other men in the family. And what we see is, when we look at what is the effect for peers, then we see an improvement in the labor market outcomes of the male peers of these women. We do not see an improvement even amongst the women's female peers. And these are mostly non-co-residing, as I pointed out, relatives. So these are also people who would know the husbands of these wives. Second, we also see higher job offers being made to husbands. And interestingly, there is no difference in the registration rates between the husbands and the wives. So this is being, again, driven by potentially the fact that you have this, men are taking advantage of this higher flow of information. Remember, the number of people who will have information about some job opening is going to be double of what it is in the non-network treatment arm, because more people are getting onto the platform, and many of them are likely to be known to the husbands. We collected very detailed data on attitudes towards women working. I'm not able to present those results here, and I think it is in a sense makes us feel better that when we look at the index of regressive attitudes, which means, asking, agreeing with questions like women's relationships with their children are going to be adversely affected if they work. Women should not work if their husbands earn, and so on and so forth. We see a fall in that, that index of regressive attitudes, but these are not sufficient to increase, obviously, the women's labor force participation in terms of the outcomes that we observe. We see a reduction in regressive attitudes, an improvement in progressive attitudes, which potentially suggests that when you tell them, you tell them about these options which are available, or you reduce these, gaps between the demand and the supply side, there might be some impacts, but still there is some barrier to women going out and working. And that is again aligned with what we saw in terms of the nature of job and, preferences that these women have. They're looking for higher status salary jobs rather than contractual daily work. They're looking for work which is more flexible, but also at the same time offers them a higher salary than they were getting, conditional on them working, they were getting currently. So women get lower offers than the men, and obviously the acceptance rate is also less. And so we conjecture that it is because of these preferences in terms of the kinds of jobs that their husbands want for them, as well as the women want for themselves, either because of the conditioning, the social conditioning, or they truly do prefer those, but we know that those come from these gender division of labor within the household and lower mobility and so on. And again, we try to think of, okay, what is the reason that we see an increase in self-employment? And we find some evidence to support the family income effect, where they could invest in home-based ventures. And these are also households where somebody had lost a job during COVID. So, there is a push factor potentially working during the pandemic. So let me just summarize now. So across these studies, what we see is that productivity enhancing technological change, whether it is within the home or at work, may not benefit women. And we've seen that there are some conditions under which they can actually worsen the labor market outcomes. And, in context where you might see an improvement in home productivity, women or women's time allocation may not change dramatically because of the low value of women's time, and also the fact that the actual time savings are going to be pretty small and not as dramatic as we would have thought. And the other is that technological change that enhance productivity at work may not be able to buffer or if it reduces the demand for tasks that are performed. So there are substitutes in a sense for the tasks that are performed by women in the production process, then women lose out, and then they do not have recourse to alternative sources of employment. In the aggregate, you're going to see a fall in their labor force participation. The second is that when we think of digital technology and we think, okay, so given these constraints that women have, lowest mobility, low value, let's try to get them the best deal that's possible out there, and try to do that within the comfort of their home by bringing this technology closer to them. What we see, unfortunately, is that gender norms and extant social network structures could actually prevent women from taking full advantage of these technologies. So if you increase access to job information, we do see the fact that take-up of this technology is much higher when we include the network of the women than when we don't. But men are taking more advantage of these information flows because women are constrained by these norms around working close to home, and they're not able, and even in the context of, if you thought about the flow of information and networks, there is a literature which is becoming pretty significant now in talking about gender differences in the structure of men's and women's networks, and the fact that women are not able to take advantage of social ties because they just have fewer of these weak ties which would bring job information to them. And we know also of work which is say that if you have more people in your network who are unemployed, the probability that you yourself would be unemployed would be low, just because you will have less information available about job openings. So I have a very simple conclusion. Basically, the technological change can have gendered impacts. And I think that the literature has not focused on this. We have tons of work which talks about technological change when we, in terms of skill displacement, but it does not have a gender perspective. And it's important to take that into account, particularly when we are moving into a scenario post-pandemic also, where technological changes are probably going to be even more rapid. And the fact that prevailing social norms and low market value for women's time can be disadvantageous to women. And so what we need are policies that improve demand for women's labor, especially in context when we see these technological changes as displacing women's labor. And also at the same time, how do we improve the demand for women's labor? The structural changes also take their own time. And so it is imperative to supplement these technological changes with reskilling and improving mobility in terms of not just physical mobility, but also, being able to take advantage of information flows to access good jobs. I'm going to stop here now. Thank you so much for listening to me. I'm happy to take more questions. So I should stop sharing, Ashwini?
Yes, I think so. So first of all, thank you, Farzana, for an excellent presentation covering 3 of your studies. And, obviously, I have a great deal of sympathy for your argument about the demand side constraints to women's employment. It's particularly significant that when agricultural technology is moving towards making the task easier, in some sense, removing that one barrier that earlier women would face because it's considered heavy work, so not suitable for women. But when technology changes the other way, when it's easier to do the same task, it's still women get displaced and not men. So suggests that it's not really, these stereotypes about what is feminine work and what is masculine work is not so much about inherent biological characteristics as much as it is about, discriminatory factors or norm related factors that allocate certain kinds of jobs to men or women. And, even clean fuels. I mean, now, of course, in India, there's an extra problem, which is that because of the high increase in prices of the LPG cylinders, even Ujjwala scheme beneficiaries are returning their LPG or not using them because they just can't afford the refill. So again, here is an example of a policy that is not, may not be a gendered policy as in price of LPG, but it has very strong gendered impacts, as you also find in terms of your technology. And the networks issue, it's, several people are raising it, and that's great because women do have fewer friendships outside of their kin networks and so on and so forth. So yeah, all the 3 points that you raised and all the 3 papers that you discussed absolutely enrich our understanding of what ails women's participation in paid work in India. There are no questions on the app, but I am sitting actually in a room with a live audience.
We can switch to the live audience.
We had a fabulous session in the morning, which you attended virtually, Farzana, and you saw that we had more than 100 people in the audience. So it was a very, very invigorating session.
Yeah.
Suddenly a question has appeared. So despite the increasing access to technology, such as via gig work, we see women's segregation in low-skilled and low-wage jobs like an urban company, which is a platform in India for the audience. So is the question about improvements in access to digital technology, or about the creation of high-skilled and high-wage jobs for women? What is the issue?
Yeah, so one of the things that probably didn't come out clearly here, and because I didn't show the characteristics of the sample, these are all blue collar workers. I'm not looking at the right tail of the distribution of skills. So when you think of, platforms like Urban Clap and so on, it's a different part of the distribution because they are more high skilled. They also cater to a very discerning customer base. These individuals have to be trained. They are actually trained by the platform, and then only are they allowed to take up gig work and so on and so forth. So these are more skilled, certified professionals, and they are catering to a very high income bracket. Whereas what I was looking at in terms of this paper, what we are doing is looking at blue collar workers who are less skilled, less educated. So these are low income areas within Delhi. And so that's why this app was not, did not require a smartphone, for instance, right? So that's one of the reasons why I went with them, because and social networks are absolutely much more critical, as all of the work that Kaiwen has done, and in terms of labor markets and so on, it does exist in developed countries, but it is much more critical for blue collar workers as opposed to white collar workers also. It's not to say that it doesn't matter, but it's just a lot more critical for blue collar workers.
So on that note, there's a clarification on the language question. So the question was asking whether the app was in Hindi or in English.
Okay, it can be in Hindi or English. I think they have both options. You can choose which one you want to use.
Okay.
Yeah, so actually, if you go to the website of the portal, they have both Hindi and English. Everything is there. So if somebody went directly to the portal like a worker, then they would be able to figure it.
So the audience sitting here, would you like to ask a question? Anyone has a question? Aviroop.
I had asked Abhiroop not to ask me any difficult questions.
He's
Abhiroop,
going to ask you a very difficult question. We are just getting the microphone. In the meanwhile, I'm just going to read out a question that's come. I'm extrapolating a bit. Could we expect that after COVID, due to work from home / flexibility, the labor force participation rate for highly educated women, undergraduate and above, would increase?
Yeah, actually it would. I think Ashwini probably can answer this better than me because I haven't looked at the entire distribution, but I'd say
there's no evidence of that yet. I mean,
yeah,
LinkedIn
but I think the
data.
hypothesis could be, Ashwini, that those people who are in the services sector, and these are likely to be people who are more educated, in the higher earnings bracket and white collar jobs, like what we've seen in the West. At least the evidence from the West suggests that they are able to transition more easily to work from home. And in the event that schools open and childcare is not a constraint, and women can continue working from home, you might see some sort of a non-linear relationship between pre-COVID and after COVID. But in India, we don't know. I mean, it's a very small proportion of the population, I'd say.
Okay, Abhiroop. Can you hear Farzana?
It's a bit faint, but I can.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. So this is, relating to this, when you look at all the statistics from the National Sample Survey or the PLFS, especially with relation to women, it's not always clear, how to interpret not being in the labor force vis-a-vis unemployment, and there's always this fuzzy line, we're never sure. So more recently in the PLFS, we see some rise in declared unemployment rates by women. I'm wondering, in your survey, because you're trying to make women work, did you measure how many of them actually were looking for jobs at the time that you gave them the platform? Or was it that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, if you go back, I'm not sharing I can't share the slides again, but let me see. I can show you, I don't know if it's, when I was showing this table, when we were looking at the job preferences, then one of the categories that we did ask is, are you looking for work or not? So we are very conscious of, how we define not working. So here you see not working, unemployed, right? You see this 2% and 4%, right? So what we mean by unemployed here is that you want to work, but you're not finding work. And we've asked this across all the rounds of our survey. Does that answer your question? So we are conscious of defining it carefully in the sense of not presuming that if you are not in the workforce, you're not looking for work. Yeah.
No, there's a.
I don't know if that was visible.
Yeah, Bhaskar has a question.
Oh my God. It's getting more and more difficult. I think Bhaskada is going to ask me something about networks. Bhaskada, I don't have the answer.
That will be my second question. My first question was about your different technology. If I understood you right, you said that you're looking at the impact of increased tractor usage. And you said that tractors help in tilling, better tilling, and that reduced the need for weeding, which is an occupation primarily done by women. So, to some extent, this technology was sort of labor displacing as far as women are concerned. So that's not surprising then that there was a sort of adverse effect on women's labor force participation. So this doesn't really answer the question of is technology, does that lead to lower or higher labor force participation for women? So for instance, what would have happened if there was a technological improvement in something to do with weeding? Which is something that should help women.
Ashwini, can you translate that, because it was broken up, so I couldn't hear carefully.
Yeah, so the question is that the technological change in tractors, in tilling, and the women that are getting displaced is from weeding, they're getting displaced from weeding, right?
Yeah.
So what if there was a technological change in weeding?
Yeah.
Which might have helped women. So is it about technological change, or is it about the kind of occupation that is getting technologically upgraded?
Yes.
What would have happened if there'd been technological change in weeding?
Yes, I think, yeah. So the point that we are trying to make is at what level did the technological change happen, right? It happened in an upstream task, which was the technology was complementary to men's labor. Remember, men are also more engaged in tilling, right? So you would have thought that if machines are coming in, is it going to displace men's labor? But it doesn't displace their labor, because their labor, they're the ones who are driving the tractors, right? So, and then it is the task. So you're absolutely right. It is possible that if the technological change happened in some other task or further downstream, it depends on what the technology was and whether women can be complementary to that technology or not. So for instance, when I say that men are complementary to tractors, it's because they have the skill to drive. But if women do not have that skill, or whatever the technological changes in weeding, and they do not have the skill to be able to use that technology, it is possible that they could get displaced. So I think the point that I was trying to make finally also was that skilling is important. There are, when technology changes, do you have skills which complement that technology or not? And possibly it is the case that men were, they had the skills, they were able to complement the tractors coming in. But I can't say necessarily that if the technology comes in weeding, women are also going to be complementary to that. It just depends upon what the technology is and whether women's skill set would be complementary to that or not, or whether they would be substitutes. And so the point basically is to say that, anything that is productivity enhancing is not necessarily going to, displace all kinds of labor. This technological change that happened was essentially to, you can say, reduce the cost of labor in some sense, but who bore the brunt of it? It was those who were completely displaced by that technology. Now that could be anyone. In this particular context, it was these women.
Thank you. So my second question is actually to do with networks.
Second question is to do with networks.
Oh, yeah, I was expecting that.
If I understood you right, when you construct the network, you are looking at close acquaintances.
Close acquaintances.
Yeah, when you construct the network, you're looking at close acquaintances.
At people with social ties. So it could be at work, it could be neighbors, it could be anybody, anywhere. Like, who do you go to if you have an emergency? Who would you borrow money from? So it doesn't have to be physical proximity.
He's asking the question now. Yeah.
Okay.
Essentially, people you know well, either because they're neighbors or whatever, people you know well.
It's people who you know well already. That's the question. Is that how the network is getting constructed?
Yeah, it is people who you know well. So we are trying to elicit who are the people you are most closely connected to, whether it is at the home or it is at work or it is neighborhood, or because we also ask who do you talk to on the phone. So it could be just somebody very far away as well that you speak with on the phone regularly. So it could be emotional dependence as well. So we're just trying to look at different dimensions: financial, emotional, work related.
Yeah, his question is coming now.
Okay.
In the networks literature, this would be known as strong ties.
Strong ties, absolutely, yes.
So
not what you mean is this is not weak ties. So in a network sense, so I think what you're trying to say is that this is not about weak ties. These are very strong ties, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, absolutely, you're right. So
wait, Farzana, wait, he has a question.
Okay.
So this actually goes back to Mark Canovator, who is a sociologist. He found many years ago, and now it's part of the network's goal, that information flows are stronger from weak ties rather than from strong ties. In particular, information about jobs.
Yes.
So why do we look at strong ties rather than weak ties?
I don't think when we started to elicit about, who their network was, we did not, focus on or try to elicit only strong ties. It ends up being the case that women's networks are tighter and narrower because they have more strong ties relative to men. And I think it's becoming pretty accepted in this literature in terms of ties, that women's ties tend to be stronger and fewer as opposed to men who have more weaker ties. So men have more weak ties, and there the flow of information about jobs is much greater than women. Women have fewer weak ties. So the flow of information on jobs and so on is, much less for them. And I think if you, I think I understand what you're trying to say. And I think Amrita also says that, do we want to call this network or be more careful in terms of talking about peers and ties? And we should absolutely, yes, discuss that in the paper, that, be more careful about how we are presenting this. But in general, I would say that that's what the literature also says, that men have more weak ties. So if you look at the proportion of men who report friends at workplace and, physically also further away from them in that table, then men are reporting more weak ties and women are reporting more strong ties.
Okay, we have 2 minutes more because it's a part of an international conference. So we have to end exactly at 7:30. So yeah, just literally half a minute each. Loudly.
I can't hear anything.
Hello?
It hasn't started yet.
My question is on this mobility thing. So I actually want to know, like, apart from this preference of women for closer place of work, what are the other factors that might affect their commutation time for paid work? Because in India's context, if I've looked into the data, I found that women.
Sorry, can you give the mic to Daksh, because let's take both the questions because there's a hard stop at 7:30. Yes.
A couple of very short questions, Professor. One was, is there any literature about the impact of like a technological change for men and women working in like the same field? So, for example, in agriculture at the same level, is that also differential in terms of how their labor force is impacted? And the other was, in the last paper, are you also looking at more long run impacts? Maybe it is that men benefit in the short run at the adoption of things like technology or technological innovation takes a little longer for women for whatever reason. So do we also have some literature on that long run adoption, or are you looking at that in your study? Thank you.
Farzana, did you get the question?
The last question was clearer to me. So the question on long run versus short run. So this is, we've looked at it 1 year later. And as I pointed out, there is actually no difference in registration rates and take-up of technology between men and women. So that's not what is driving these results. The fact that's driving these results is the fact that, men are getting more offers for jobs and so on. But you are absolutely right. There might be some short-term and long-term differences. On the farm mechanization, I think you were trying to ask what other papers say about gender differences. They don't look at mechanization in particular, but changes in farm technology, like using high yielding variety of seeds and so on. Those are also technological changes, right? So there's a pretty big literature on, for example, the green revolution, but it doesn't look at what the labor market impacts or labor use impacts are. So we think that, we are pretty new in what we are talking about, hopefully, or that's at least our understanding of the literature. And the first question I did not get, so I
mobility differences between men and women affecting their ability to take up jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what we are trying to say, that mobility differences do affect their ability to take up jobs, but that's why this technology is trying to, reduce that constraint. And so potentially going to, be more beneficial to women because it's a hyperlocal, it's telling you who are the employers available closest to you. And as I showed you, women want to travel 3 kilometers at most, as opposed to men who are willing to travel up to 7 kilometers for a job. So you're absolutely right that mobility does matter. And, one of the ways in which we can address that is by bringing work closer to them. Yeah.
All right. On that note, thank you very much, Farzana, for a most exciting.
Thank you so much, Ashwini. I really appreciate it. And really thank you everyone for the very, engaged audience and all the questions that you asked. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
The 7:30, there's a new session starting, so we have to log off now. But thank you everyone to the audience.
Thank you everyone. It was a great audience, great workshop, Ashwini. Thank you.